Hello everyone, thanks for joining me today. This is Black Royalty speaking. So this is part 2 of the sacrifice talk. I'll quickly give a recap of what we discussed in part 1. So in part 1 we gave a definition of what sacrifice is, which is to give up something that is valuable to you. We went through 10 characteristics of a sacrifice, which I'll quickly run through. Number 1, not everyone can do it because it is difficult or challenging. Number 2, the one giving the sacrifice has no knowledge or assurance of any positive outcome for themselves. Number 3, it is optional, giving of one's free will. You don't do it because you are pressured or commanded. Number 4, the one offering the sacrifice is disadvantaged permanently by reason of the sacrifice. Number 5, options are limited, mostly to 2. Either carry out the sacrificial act or escape the situation. Number 6, the one offering of the sacrifice does not burden the beneficiaries of the sacrifice with threats, requirements, or rules. Number 7, the one offering of the sacrifice does not decide or dictate who the beneficiaries of the sacrifice will be. The act is impartial. Number 8, the sacrifice of Jesus does not match the definition of a sacrifice, which is to give up something that is valuable to you in order to help another person. Number 9, if people or humanity was tainted by the sin of Adam without having to believe, then they should be made righteous by Jesus without having to believe. And number 10, you do not plan a sacrifice. So part 2 will focus on some instances of human beings carrying out what we can term sacrificial acts. And what I'll do is I'll run through the different stories and pick one of them just to see if it tallies with the 10 characteristics or attributes of a sacrifice which we discussed in part 1. Now, out of all the stories I'm going to discuss here, you can pick any one of them, and to match it against the attributes of a sacrifice. So let's just quickly pick the first story. It has to do with RMS Titanic. The liner's 35 engineering staff members who lost their lives during the maritime disaster, as none of the engineering crew survived the sinking on 15th April 1912. There was sadly no first-hand account of the men's actions at the official inquiry. However, there is no doubt that every engineer remained on board to maintain the RMS Titanic's electrical power during the sinking. By keeping the liner's lights on, they helped reduce passenger panic while enabling the wireless officers to send distress signals to nearby ships. Pure sacrifice. World War II. Lieutenant John Robert Fox, the 29-year-old GI, served in Somocolonia, a mountain village in Italy, which was subject to brutal fighting between US and German forces. On Christmas Day, the US forces had gained control of the picturesque town, with members of Fox's unit kindly handing out cheese and chocolates to villagers. The next day, the German counterattack began in the early hours of the morning as expected. As Fox was an artillery spotter, his role required him to radio coordinates to inform the units where to deliver their payloads. As the German attack was severe, the US unit was forced to retreat, hiding in his lookout position on the second floor of a house. He used the radio to contact his unit to request that artillery fire be directed at the village. This would provide the troops with enough time to retreat. When the artillery officer stated, "Fox, that will be on you," he reportedly replied, "Fire it. There's more of them than there are of us." This sacrifice provided necessary cover for the retreating soldiers, which allowed the US unit to regroup and reclaim Somocolonia a few days later. True act of sacrifice. Holocaust. Many stories have emerged of truly brave individuals who selflessly risked their lives to save others during the Holocaust. One story that is impossible to forget is that of Maximilian Kolbe, a Polish priest who was sent to Auschwitz concentration camp in 1941. The Nazis slowly starved prisoners at the death camp as they each received small rations that couldn't sustain a child. Each prisoner received a cup of imitation coffee each morning and a weak soup and half a loaf of bread following work. With everyone struggling to secure a place to receive their ration of food, Father Maximilian Kolbe would stand aside to allow others to eat, which meant there was often limited food for him. There was also a rule in Auschwitz that 10 men would be killed if one attempted to escape from the concentration camp. A man from Kolbe's bunker escaped in July 1941, so 10 men were selected to be starved to death. As Francisc Gajowicz, sorry, I'm not pronouncing the name correctly, one of the chosen prisoners cried in anguish, Kolbe stepped forward to the commandant and said, "I am a Catholic priest, let me take his place. I am old. He has a wife and children." The commandant accepted his request, and the priest took Gajowicz's place. After 2 weeks of hunger and thirst, Kolbe was the only person in the group who was fully conscious. He raised his left arm to Bock, an executioner who injected the priest with a fatal dose of carbolic acid on August 14, 1941. True act of sacrifice. Twin Towers. When Nigerian-born Godwin Ajala first arrived in the United States, he was forced to endure various poorly paid jobs until he secured a permanent position as an access control officer at the World Trade Center. His role required him to walk various floors and ride the elevators at the two towers to secure the building and provide assistance for small emergencies. When he wasn't working at the towers, he was preparing to take the New York State bar exam. When the planes hit the World Trade Center, 33-year-old Ajala selflessly helped thousands of people to evacuate the towers. He reportedly held the door open for people as they fled the building, and he guided others out of the towers to safety. Sadly, he later succumbed to exhaustion and fell into a coma, passing away the following Sunday. Another selfless act, a true sacrifice. Alexander Shtcherkin and the scientists of Stalingrad. Nobody can say for certain how many people died from starvation during the 900-day siege of Leningrad. But it's safe to say that you could count the number of people who chose to starve to death despite sitting on huge supplies of potatoes, rice, and other food staples on one hand. Alexander Shtcherkin and his colleague Dmitry Ivanov did just that. They chose to go hungry rather than eat the collection of genetically modified crops and plants they have been tasked with preserving for future generations. Both scientists were employees of the Vavilov Institute of Plant Industry. The state body had been ordered to build up huge collections of plants and crop seeds. In all, they managed to bring together 187,000 types of plants, 40,000 of them food crops. These were to be kept safe for future generations. But as the Nazi siege of the city went into its second and then its third winter, the team would have been under huge amounts of pressure just to give in and raid their supplies to fend off the unbearable hunger. Shtcherkin in particular could have easily saved himself. He was the man in charge of groundnut supplies, so he would have had many calorie-heavy nuts at his disposal. But still, he resisted. In the end, he was found slumped over his desk. Just a few days later, his colleague Ivanov also died. He was the head of the Institute's rice collection. Again, he chose to starve rather than raid the protected supplies of genetically important plants. Several other scientists also paid the ultimate sacrifice. None dared touch the valuable supplies, driven by a potent mixture of fear and patriotism. In the end, the Institute survived the war. After almost 3 years of horror, the supplies remained intact and all accounted for. And so was the sacrifice of And so, was the sacrifice made by Stukin, Ivanov, and other scientists worth it? Undoubtedly, yes. Even today, farmers around the world, including in the United States, grow crops that have been developed from the genetically modified seeds of the Vavilov Institute of Plant Machinery. Sorry, Vavilov Institute of Plant Industry. I beg your pardon. So, thank you for bearing with me. A few instances of when human beings, people, carried out acts which we can deem worthy of being called a sacrifice. Let's just take the last one. Strychnine and his colleagues, the Vavilov Institute of Plant Industry. And let's see if it matches what we can term as the characteristics of a sacrifice. So the story I just mentioned, the scientists, the city was besieged by the enemy. There was no food coming in or out, and they had this store of food which they had to preserve, and they refused to eat the food, and they all died. Let's look if it matches the 10 characteristics of a sacrifice. Number one, not everyone can do it because it is difficult, challenging. Needless to say, that is true. I think according to studies, don't quote me on this, but I think human beings resort to cannibalism on the 7th day or so of hunger, of famine. And for the fact that they chose not to eat that food, instead to starve to death. Not everyone can do it. That's a fact. That's a given. Number two, the one giving the sacrifice has no knowledge or assurance of any positive outcome for themselves. Well, clearly, they saw no way out. Absolutely no way out. They didn't even know if history will record it or they'll get any, accolade or glory from it, because the enemy could have come in, bombed the institute, burnt everything, and taken all the grain. They didn't know. Number three, it is optional and given of one's free will. You don't do it because you are pressured or commanded. I very much doubt if these people were under military intelligence, or under the rule of the military. They sound like normal scientists, and they could have said, you know what, let's eat some and preserve ourselves and preserve our lives. They did it out of their own free will. They chose to die and preserve the grain. Number four, the one offering the sacrifice is disadvantaged permanently by reason of the sacrifice. Well, none of the scientists are here. They all died. None of them came back to life. Number five, options are limited, mostly to two: either carry out the sacrificial act or escape the situation. They could have eaten the food. They didn't have, they were not able to page or message the USS command to send in artillery or call in Dr. Manhattan. They had just two options, and they decided to carry out the sacrificial act. Number six, the one offering of the sacrifice does not burden the beneficiaries of the sacrifice with threats, requirements, or rules. So Strychnine and his colleagues didn't say, oh, okay, we are not going to eat this grain, but because we're not going to eat it, anyone who wants to benefit from it has to not work on the Sabbath, has to wear a pointed hat, must not be... there were absolutely no threats, requirements, or rules for the beneficiaries of the sacrifice. Number seven, the one offering of the sacrifice does not decide or dictate who the beneficiaries of the sacrifice will be. The act is impartial. Strychnine and his colleagues didn't say, oh, I'm only doing this so that only for Russians, or only for Polish people, or only for Khazarians or True Bloods or anything. No. They didn't dictate who the beneficiaries will be. Number eight, okay, this was directly tied to what Jesus did on the cross, not matching the definition of a sacrifice. But the story of Alexander Sitchin does, because it says to give up something that is valuable to you in order to help another person or other people. And yes, they gave up their food, they got hungry, and they gave up their lives. And it does match the definition of a sacrifice. Number 9, okay, this is specifically tailored towards what Jesus did on the cross, because it says if people were tainted by the sin of Adam without having to believe, then they should be made righteous by Jesus without having to believe. So it doesn't apply here. Number 10, you don't plan a sacrifice. I very much doubt if Alexander Sitchin and his colleagues, went to the German forces and said, come, besiege our town, and we'll pretend, that we can't eat and all that so we can get some glory or make some name. I mean, okay, if they had done that, would you actually term what they did a sacrifice or a setup or some? I don't even, I don't even know to very wicked egotistical trip. Yeah. So you can literally pick any of the stories I've mentioned, from the RMS Titanic, the engineers there, to Lieutenant John Robert Fox, who called artillery fire upon himself so that the enemy can be killed, to the Holocaust survivors, the Polish priest who decided to take the death penalty in place of another person, to the Twin Towers, the Nigerian-born Gordon Ajala, who selflessly worked to get people out of the towers, and not minding, about his own health, and he succumbed to exhaustion and died. Or Alexander Sitchin. You can pick any of these and run them through the 10 characteristics of a sacrifice, and they will all match. Okay, I think the 9, except the one that was specifically tailored to Jesus Christ. But they will match these characteristics of a sacrifice. Each and every one of them. Jesus planned his sacrifice, knew the outcome, looked forward to the glory he will get after the sacrifice, had countless options on how it could transpire, selects a tiny percent of humanity to benefit from his sacrifice, dictates what the beneficiaries of his sacrifice must do in order to enjoy the advantage. This was an inconvenience for a weekend, a scheduled upgrade, not a sacrifice. Thank you so much for listening.